The year is 1177 BC, and the world is on fire. If you were a merchant on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, you'd spent your whole life looking at the horizon that meant wealth. You saw the great cedar built ships of Egypt, the heavy grain carriers of the Hittites, and the purple dyed sails of the Phoenicians. The Mediterranean was a highway toward opportunity. It was the internet of the Bronze Age, a high speed connection between every palace, from the Nile River to the Aegean Sea. Then, almost overnight, the signal went dead. The ships stopped coming. The smoke on the horizon wasn't from a cooking fire or a pottery kiln. It was from the funeral pyres of cities like Ugarit on the Syrian coast or Enkomi on the island of Cyprus. The great kings, the men who claimed to be gods themselves, sent frantic letters to one another, begging for help that never came. One of the last tablets we found from this era said it all. The enemy is here. The cities are burned. We are alone. This is the moment the lights went out. We call it the Late Bronze Age collapse. It's the most violent, most complete collapse of every known structure in human history. And right in the middle of that wreckage, at the exact moment the global superpowers are vanishing from the map, the Bible drops us into the most chaotic, gritty, and often misunderstood era of Israel's history. We call it the era of the Judges. You see, we usually treat the book of Judges like a series of disconnected campfire stories about superheroes with long hair and fleeces, like the Bible's versions of the Greek demigods and their adventures. But when you look at the charred evidence left in the dirt, you realize that the cycles of the Judges didn't happen in a fairy tale. It happened in the middle of a world ending collapse. While the Hittite Empire was being erased and Egypt was retreating behind its borders, the Israelites were standing on the ridges of the Judean hills, looking down into a landscape that was being reset in real time. The Bronze Age collapse is dated to 1177 BC, but in reality, it didn't happen all at once. It lingered. While the Israelites were scratching out a living in the rocky high country, the valleys were still held by the ghosts of the old world. You had Canaanite kings and fortified cities who still had chariots and the gold, trying to maintain the old god king status quo. And then you had the newcomers. Out of the smoke of the Mediterranean collapse came a group of survivors the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples. We know some of them as the Philistines from the Bible. They were like ancient pirates, but more organized and a little less Disney-esque. They were a sophisticated iron-working military machine that had just inherited the wreckage of the coast. For the entire period of the Judges, and right through the rise of the first Israelite kings, the Philistines held the keys to the future. We know from the account in 1 Samuel that they enforced a brutal tech embargo, ensuring no blacksmith could be found in all the land of Israel. They wanted the Hebrews toothless, restricted to sharpening their wooden plows at Philistine workshops, while the Philistines themselves patrolled the valleys with iron swords. You could call this the Iron Age reset. It's a 400-year period where God was clearing the board, letting the global empires of the Bronze Age crumble into the dust to make room for something the world had never seen before. He was dismantling the mighty to make room for an unsung hero from Bethlehem who would finally finish the conquest of Canaan. Today, we're going to look at the smoking ruins of this massive transition. We're going to find out why the era of the Judges had to be so violent, why the Philistines were the ultimate gatekeepers of this new age, and how the slow fade of the world's greatest empires was the very thing that allowed a tiny nation of shepherds and priests to survive. Before we get to the rest of that, just one simple announcement. I have a newsletter. If you like to get emails about Bible stuff, Bible theology, unique takes on old passages, or some of the lost notes from some of my teaching videos here, then sign up for my newsletter. You can get a link in the description under this video, and I'll try and put a QR code on the video here for you to click there as well. So, back to the story of the Judges. When we talk about the Judges, we have to stop thinking about them as robed figures sitting in some quiet, orderly courtroom. I know that's what I thought when I was a kid. That's a modern projection on an ancient reality, though. In the wreckage of the late Bronze Age collapse, a judge wasn't a bureaucrat. They were a localized, often violent response to a global catastrophe. If we were looking for a word to describe them today in modern America, we might call them something more akin to vigilantes. They were the superheroes of their time, really, rough-edged and rising out of the ash because nobody else was coming to help. They didn't have a Batman or a Wonder Woman or a Superman at the time, but they did have Shamgar, and they had Deborah, and they had Samson. Ehud and Jael operated with the cold precision of a Black Widow or a Hawkeye. And in Gideon, you see that same reluctant, humble leadership that makes the Avengers follow Captain America. They were a lot like our superheroes. The diversity of this group tells you everything you need to know about the desperation of the era, too. You had a female prophetess, a left-handed assassin, a socially displaced mercenary, and a farmer with a brutal cattle prod. They were necessary because the central nervous system of the world had been severed. With no more Egyptian garrisons to keep the peace and no imperial law to appeal to, these figures were essentially a frontier force, the only thing standing between a tribe of shepherds and total erasure. To understand the world they survived, you have to look at the telltale fingerprints of a civilization in its death throes. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to show you how these biblical accounts line up perfectly with the chaotic reality of a collapsing world. Much of the secular history I've gathered for this investigation comes from Eric Klein's work, a book called 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed. It's honestly one of my favorite history books. I've read it a couple of times. It's a remarkable look at how the lights went out on the old world. For those of you looking for the theological grounding beneath our feet, I've also relied on another book, The World Around the Old Testament. It's also another one of my favorites, a comprehensive study by Hebrew scholars that helps bridge the gap between the archaeological record and the biblical text. I'm going to link to both of those books in the description, and if I can, I'll try and link them in the video as well. Now, back to the story of the judges themselves. The first thing that happens when a technologically superior power moves into a neighborhood is disarmament. If you're the Philistines, the guys with the secret to smelting iron, you don't want the hill country tribes carrying swords. And in this period where the tin has dried up, bronze is difficult to come by, iron is the only metal, really, that can make any kind of weapon. There's this tiny one-verse mention in Judges 3 about a man named Shamgar. It says he saved Israel by killing 600 Philistines with an ox goad. Now, an ox goad isn't a weapon. It's a long wooden pole with a sharpened point used to nudge livestock. It's a farm tool. The historical reality here is stark. Shamgar wasn't choosing to be quirky with his weaponry. He was using an ox goad because he didn't have a choice. This is the practical result of the tech embargo we see later in 1 Samuel. If the Philistines controlled the iron and the smiths, the Israelites were forced to weaponize their agriculture. Shamgar is the evidence of a disarmed population fighting a partisan war with improvised tools. It's the first hint that the Promised Land was being held under a technological blockade. A similar kind of thing has happened in many other countries for many, many years. While the Israelites were dealing with the tech-heavy Philistines on the coast, they were being squeezed from the east by the petty kingdoms of Moab and Ammon. Take the story of Ehud, for example. The Bible tells us the king of Moab, a man named Eglon, had actually moved across the Jordan and occupied Jericho, called the City of Palms. Now ask yourself, why was a minor king from the desert able to seize a strategic Israelite gateway? Well, it's because of the power vacuum I spoke about in the last two videos. For centuries, Egypt had kept the peace in the Levant. They had local garrisons, like a police force, and they kept the local warlords in check. But during the collapse, Egypt pulled its troops back to the Nile. They left the neighborhood wide open. So when the bully of the Bronze Age vanished, it didn't lead to peace. It led to a regional shakedown. Warlords like Eglon rushed in to seize strategic assets, like water sources and trade routes. Ehud's assassination of Eglon is evidence of a void. It was an insurgency strike against a local strongman trying to fill the empty space left by the falling empires. And by the time we get to Deborah and Barak, we see the last gasp of the old world's military dominance. They were facing Sisera, a general with 900 chariots of iron. In the Bronze Age, the chariot was the main battle tank. If you had chariots and the other guy didn't, then you owned the plains and the valleys. The Israelite infantry, which was stuck in the rocky hills, had no counter for this. They were effectively pinned in. They had no chariots. But look at how the battle went at the Kishon River. The Bible says the stars fought, and the river swept them away. Geologically, we know that the Kishon is prone to flash flooding. But God's timing of the flood was a miracle. He used the climate to neutralize a superior technology, moving supernaturally in the physical world. He turned the valleys into a mud pit where the invincible chariots became heavy, useless anchors. It was the moment the main battle tank of the Bronze Age met its match in a changing world. If you want to know why the story of Gideon, for example, feels so desperate, you have to look at the weather also. The Bible says the Midianites swarmed the land like locusts, stealing every scrap of grain and every head of livestock. Historians now know that a massive global mega drought was a primary driver of the Bronze Age collapse. The Midianites were just raiders out for a thrill. They were climate refugees, in a way. They were starving. In a world where the rains had stopped and the harvests were failing from Babylon to Greece, the Midianites were coming for the only thing left: Israel's subsistence crops. Gideon's struggle wasn't just about faith in this case, it was about survival in a world of extreme resource scarcity. It's the physical proof of a planet in death spiral, where the fight for a loaf of bread becomes a holy war. As the Bronze Age collapse ground on, the social structures of the old cities began to shatter. This produced a group of people the ancient texts call the Abiru, socially displaced outcasts and mercenaries and worthless men who lived in the wild zones. Their name kind of sounds like Hebrew, and it may have some linguistic connection, but the concept of the Abiru was a little bit broader than just the Hebrews. Jephthah is the biblical embodiment of this. He was an outcast, the son of a prostitute, driven away by his family to lead a gang of mercenaries in the land of Tob. In the Bronze Age, a man like Jephthah would have been a non-entity, but in the collapse, power shifts from the established kings to the strong men who can survive in the cracks of society. And when the elders of Gilead came begging Jephthah to lead them, they were admitting that the old systems had failed. They needed a man who knew how to live in the wreckage. Jephthah is the mark of the mercenary age of this period, the time when the displaced become the only ones left who know how to fight. And then we have Samson. We usually focus on his strength, but look at his geography. He spent his entire life on the fence between the Israelite hills and the Philistine coast. The Philistines were the high-tech gatekeepers. By holding the iron and the coast, they inadvertently did something crucial. They kept Israel penned in. They acted as a wall. While the rest of the world was being overrun by shifting populations and collapsing trade, Israel was forced to stay in the hills and develop its own culture, its own law, and its own identity. This isolation acted as an incubator. The Philistine pressure forced the tribes to stop acting like individuals and start acting like a nation. Samson was the first spark of a national consciousness that was being forged under the pressure of this Iron Age reset. It's intriguing to consider this final act as well, the collapse of the Philistine temple. The late Bronze Age collapse was marked by widespread destruction, including evidence of seismic activity across the region. While the Bible attributes the temple's fall to Samson's divine strength, it occurred in an area already defined by devastating sudden collapses. Samson's physical breaking of the temple mirrors the epochal breaking of the Bronze Age world perfectly, possibly even utilizing a structural weakness left by the very earthquakes that destabilized the ancient world. Of course, it still took immense strength. This act ends in the darkest place imaginable, the story of the Levite and his concubine. It's a story of a horrific violence, followed by a civil war that nearly wiped the tribe of Benjamin off the face of the earth. The Bible summarizes this period in Judges 21, verse 25, with a chilling phrase. It says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes." This is the final stage of a systems collapse. It's not an external invasion, it's an internal cannibalism. When there's no central authority and no shared moral foundation, a society consumes itself. This is the Lord of the Flies moment for Israel. It's the moment that proves the old world is officially gone, the transition is complete, and the people are finally desperate enough to stop asking for a judge and they start asking for someone else. Exhausted by the chaos, Israel would beg for a king so they could be like the nations, it says. They would get exactly what they asked for in Saul, a tall, impressive shadow of the very Bronze Age strongmen God was currently dismantling. Saul was the curse before the blessing. By the time the prophet Samuel was an old man, the people of Israel had reached a breaking point. Imagine this scene: the elders of the tribes traveling up to Ramah, their sandals caked in the dust of a dozen different battlefields. They weren't coming for a blessing, they were coming with a demand. They were exhausted. For nearly 400 years, they had lived on a knife's edge. They had survived the Dark Age shakedowns, the Philistine tech blockades, and that very terrifying anarchy where every man was his own law. They looked around at the smoking ruins of the world and decided they had enough of this reset. They wanted out of the incubator. Their request to Samuel was simple: but it carried the weight of 1,000 years of history. We see it in 1 Samuel 8, verse 5, where they finally said, "Appoint for us a king to judge us like all the other nations." They wanted a human king they could see because they had lost the nerve to trust the heavenly king they couldn't. They wanted normalcy more than they wanted the promise. And isn't that a temptation for so many of us? Samuel understood the gravity of what they were asking. He knew that a king like the nations was a regressive decision, not progress. It was a return to the systems of Egypt. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, he gave them a warning that sounded less like a sermon and more like a geopolitical intelligence briefing, almost like a prophecy itself. He didn't talk about glory or crowns. He talked about one word that defined the Bronze Age empires: take. He told them, "This will be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons and daughters and appoint them for himself, for his chariots and to be his horsemen. And he will take your daughters to be confectionaries and to be cooks and to be bakers. And he will take your fields and your vineyards and your olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. And he will take the tenth of your seed and of your vineyards, and ye shall be his servants." What a foreboding prophecy. Samuel was describing the taker model. It was the blueprint of the old world. A Bronze Age king was a consumer of his people. He didn't exist to protect the nation existed to support the king's wealth and his military ambitions. Samuel was telling them that by asking for a king, they weren't gaining a shield, they were gaining a burden. They were trading their direct connection to the Creator for a weak imitation. But the people wouldn't listen. They were too afraid of the Philistine iron and the Moabite raiders. As recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 19 and 20, they replied, "Nay, but we will have a king over us, that we also be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles." So God gave them exactly what they asked for. He gave them Saul. Now, we often think of Saul's character flaws, but you have to look at this spec sheet that he carried. Saul was exactly what a Bronze Age recruiter would have been looking for in a king. The Bible said he was an impressive man without equal, a head taller than anyone else in the land. He looked like the god kings of the old world. He had the height and the muscle and the pedigree. But Saul was a shadow. He was a king built for the old world in a time when that world was already dead. He tried to fight the Philistines with the old tactics, the old pride, the old taker mentality. And as a result, he spent his life chasing ghosts and losing his mind. He was the curse before the blessing, the king the people wanted before the king they needed. Because while Saul was trying to build a palace in the middle of a reset, God's attention was somewhere else. He didn't care about the tall man with the crown. He was looking at a boy in a pasture who didn't want to take anything from anyone, but was ready to give everything for the sheep of Israel. The Iron Age required a different kind of king. It required a giver. And as Saul's kingdom began to fray at the edges, the stage was set for the final phase of the reset to begin. By the year 1000 BC, the silence across the ancient world was deafening. The great powers that had once dictated the terms of existence were either completely erased or had retreated behind their own borders to nurse their wounds. The high-speed connection of the Bronze Age was gone. The global trade routes were cold. The stage was set for a new kind of leader to step out of the pasture and finish what Joshua had started centuries before. And when we look at the rise of David, we have to see him as more than just a famous king. We have to see him as a closer. David did more than rule, he concluded. For generations, the Promised Land had remained a patchwork of unfinished business. There were still Canaanite strongholds that the tribes simply could not crack. The most stubborn of these was a high, rocky fortress called Jebus. It sat right in the heart of the land, a persistent mark on the old world that refused to vanish. To the people of that day, Jebus was considered impregnable. The Jebusites even mocked David, claiming that the blind and the lame could defend their walls against him. But David understood the new landscape. He possessed a strategic intelligence that knew how to find the cracks in the armor. In 2 Samuel chapter 5, David captured the stronghold of Zion, renaming it the City of David. By taking Jerusalem, he didn't just seize a city, he removed the final Canaanite splinter from the center of the nation. He turned a holdout of the old world into a capital of the new one. With Jerusalem secured, David turned his attention to the west. For the entire period of the judges, the Philistines had been the high-tech gatekeepers of the coast. They held the iron, They held the smiths to work the iron, and they held the economic keys to the Mediterranean. They had kept Israel penned in, acting as a technological wall that prevented the tribes from ever becoming a true regional power. David changed the math and broke the Philistine monopoly. He campaigned until the Philistine Sea Peoples were no longer the lords of the valley, but a contained coastal entity. As the transition drew to a close, the Bible records a phrase that had not been heard since the days of the Exodus. We find it in 2 Samuel 7, verse 1. And it came to pass, when the king sat in his house, and the Lord had given him rest round about from all his enemies. That word, rest, is the evidence that the reset was complete. The Dark Age Incubator had done its work. Through the chaos of the collapse, the famine of the mega drought, and the pressure of the Philistine wall, God had forged a people who were no longer just refugees or shepherds. They were a kingdom unto their own. The wreckage of the Bronze Age had been cleared. In its place, something permanent had finally taken root. When you look at the biblical timeline, a question inevitably arises. Why was the temple built by Solomon and not by Joshua or someone sooner? Why did the people wait nearly 5 centuries to build a permanent home for God? The answer lies in the ruins of the Bronze Age. The conquest wasn't just about territory. It required the total dismantling of the old world. You can't build a permanent house for God on borrowed land. For 400 years, the tabernacle was the symbol of Israel. It was a tent, portable, flexible, and designed for a nation on the move. It was the architecture of the reset, built for a people navigating the wreckage of a collapse. But the temple was different. The temple was for a nation that had finally settled. David did more than win a war. He finished a transition. He took the Dark Age incubator and turned it into a kingdom. He proved that the Bronze Age had to die, its god kings had to fall, its tech monopolies had to break, and its top-heavy empires had to crumble, so the house of God could finally have a permanent address. I think this reflects a pattern in the heart of God. In Genesis, God wasn't done with creation until he could look at his work and call it good. Only then did he rest. In the same way, God wasn't done giving the land to Israel until the transition was complete, until a shepherd king had cleared the board and Solomon could take the throne in a world of peace. The rest Israel experienced was the proof that the work was finished. There's a promise, I think, hidden in this history. God's not finished until he can look at the chaos and call it good. And you know what else? God isn't done in your life until he calls it good either. So, if it's not good yet, then God's not done yet. And here's my encouragement for you. Keep believing that the same God who guided the fall of empires and the rise of kings is guiding the small details of your life too. Keep trusting him.